Hey everyone, it's been a whole year since I started doing these dinky little book reviews, which isn't too bad for something I started out of spite, and I thought to celebrate I'd do something special. So this is a mega review of every single Matthew Reilly story ever written, even Cobalt Blue, which, as of the time of uploading, has only been out for 8 days. I was originally going to upload these reviews one by one, but then I started getting enough reading requests to keep me going for a long time. So instead of just letting them sit on my hard drive for another few months, I thought I'd throw them all together and put them up as one video. But yeah, thank you so much for all the support over the past year. I really appreciate it. Anyway, these reviews are going to be in publication order, and just so everyone's aware, Matthew Reilly was one of my favourite authors as a kid, so some of them might be a little bit biased. Anyway, let's get to it. Hey everyone, I just read Contest by Matthew Reilly, and it was dumb fun. The best 90s B-movie that never was. It's a book about a doctor and his young daughter who are forced to fight in a battle royale against 8 dangerous aliens in the New York Public Library. The pros? I love the free-for-all chaos of the conflict here. It's a lot of fun. The action here is great. Each of the big set pieces has something different to offer and uses the setting of the New York Public Library in an interesting way. And Bellows, Reese and Marshall make for a great set of villains. The cons? This book feels like it was written by a 19-year-old because it was. The aliens are all pretty stock. There's one that's just a predator with horns, there's a bunch of xenomorph wannabes, etc. And Balthazar, the only non-hostile alien contestant, felt underutilized. He joins the team and that's about the extent of his arc. It may not be as well known as Reilly's later work, but I still think this is a fun read, and I'd even recommend it if you're looking for a cheesy, campy 90s sci-fi romp. And I'm giving Contest a B. Hey everyone, I just read Ice Station by Matthew Reilly, and it was a crazy rollercoaster ride from start to finish. You could say this about most of Reilly's books, but man, this would make a great movie. It's a book about the discovery of a supposed UFO beneath an Antarctic research station and the efforts of several countries to secure it for themselves. The pros? I love the free-for-all chaos between the different factions battling for control of the station. Mother is a standout character, and the action here is great throughout, but special mention goes to the shootout between the US Marines and the French paratroopers, which remains my favourite action set piece in any media. The cons? That said, the book really peaks with that first action set piece. Nothing really compares to it afterward. The characters, aside from Mother, are all pretty one note. Nobody who survives the novel goes through any sort of arc. And the story just stays at 100 for the entire book. There are new villains being introduced right up until the final chapter, and even I was a bit over it by the end. I have a lot of nostalgia for this book, so you might want to take this review with a grain of salt, but I love it. I'd easily recommend it to anyone looking for a big action blockbuster in book form, and I'm giving Ice Station an A. Hey everyone, I just read Temple by Matthew Reilly, and it was a lot. This book looked at Ice Station's pacing and said, faster! It's a book about a chaotic hunt through the Peruvian jungle for an ancient Incan idol needed to complete a weapon of mass destruction, juxtaposed with the story of the original quest by an Incan prince to hide the idol from the invading Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s. The pros? The big action set pieces shine, the riverboat chase and the climax were both standout. I really like the dual plot lines of the present day conflict and the historical invasion of Peru, and the amount of research on display is impressive. The cons? I'm putting my hand down, there are too many factions in this book. By the end there are new factions growing out of old factions, and none of them get much development or variation. All of the characters are pretty unlikable in this book. There's no one to really invest in like there was in Ice Station, excepting the characters from the 16th century, and we already know they're long dead. And there isn't much difference in the way the present day sections and the 16th century sections are written. Both use a lot of the same mannerisms common to Reilly's writing. This book is madness. It has its moments, but goodness me, slow down. It's an airport fiction action thriller, and if that's your thing, I would recommend it. But even as a long-time fan, this one wasn't really for me, and I'm giving Temple a C. Hey everyone, I just read Rewind, a spec script written by Matthew Reilly way back in 1999, and the bitterness of having been beaten to the gimmick by Memento really flies off the page. According to Reilly's website, the script has actually been adapted into a short film at some point, but I never checked to see if it's available anywhere. I wonder what it's like. It's a screenplay for a short film about the contents of a mysterious tape that people are apparently willing to kill for. The pros? The gimmick of telling the story out of order might be unexceptional in 2022, but it's used pretty effectively here. The mystery of what exactly is on the tape is built up pretty well, and the final twist was pretty good. I enjoyed it. The cons? This script is 7 pages long, there is not much depth to anything here. The dialogue wasn't that great to be honest, and this script is basically the twist. There is really nothing else to it. It's short, it's inoffensive, it's fine, but it's not really worth reading unless you feel like adapting it yourself, and I'm giving Rewind a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Mine, another Reilly short story, and it was pretty bad. More than anything, it just felt like a trial run for Temple. It's a short story about a mysterious mine in the middle of nowhere and the Australian archaeologists brought in by the American government to brave its traps and recover the treasure at its centre, but all is not as it seems. The pros? By its nature as a short story, it doesn't have time to introduce 1,000 different factions. It's simple, but it works. The giant carnivorous rats were fun, I guess. And the twist, while obvious, added a bit of spice to the story. The cons? The writing and the characters are pretty amateur and unrealistic. I don't know why, but the level of usual gore was surprisingly low, and it made the whole story feel a little tamer than Reilly's other early works. And though I enjoyed the giant carnivorous rats, they're so unrealistic that they took me out of the story. There's a whole bunch of extinct American megafauna like the giant short-faced bear that could have filled the same role, even if such an animal would have been out of its normal habitat. This story felt very similar to a lot of amateur work I've read, and I wouldn't really recommend it unless you're curious to see how far Reilly has come as a writer, since it does provide a stark contrast between his early work and his current releases. But there's not really much to get out of this story, and I'm giving The Mine a D. Sorry. Hey everyone, I just read Area 7 by Matthew Reilly, and it was pretty good. Is it possible for a story to be simultaneously epic and minuscule in scope? It's a book about a US Marine's struggle to escape a secret government facility taken over by white supremacist domestic terrorists during a visit from the president. Couldn't happen in this day and age. The pros? Schofield, Gant, and Mother all come into their own as characters here, and Book 2 is a great addition to the cast. They kept me invested here in a way they didn't in Ice Station. The action remains Reilly's biggest strength. The part where the heroes and the rogue Air Force soldiers are forced to fight by a bunch of escaped prisoners being held in the facility was a highlight. And it was nice to have a single overarching villain for the book in Caesar Russell. He anchors the conflict in a way the bad guys from Ice Station and Temple never did. The cons? Most of the new secondary characters are obviously cannon fodder. The book makes no attempt to flesh them out, and we all know from the start they're not making it to the final page. The 3 secondary factions in the conflict are all pretty one-note, to the point where 2 of them don't even have a leader like Caesar Russell to focus on when they barge their way into the plot. And Gant, one of the female leads, is reduced to a damsel Schofield needs to save from a serial killer during the final act, and I'm just sick of that trope in general. This book has grown on me over the years. In some ways it's better than Ice Station, and in some ways it isn't. It's more Matthew Reilly, so if you like his style of action thriller writing, you'll probably enjoy this book. I'd recommend it if you're looking for a big dumb action movie in book form, and I'm giving Area 7 a B. Hey everyone, I just read A Bad Day at Fort Bragg, a short story by Matthew Reilly available on his website, and this one felt like an idea had at 3 AM while ruminating on some intense, if hilarious, hate mail. You show me an author who hasn't done that, and I will show you a liar. It's a short story about a famous yet humble Australian thriller writer invited to tour Fort Bragg in the United States by a fan, but all is not as it seems. The pros? I enjoyed the twist. It's a little silly, but it worked for what the story is. The action scene was the highlight. It pales in comparison to a lot of his novel set pieces, but it was fun. And it doesn't outstay its welcome. The story does what it wants to do, and then ends. There was no fat to trim. The cons? Let's be honest with each other, this story is pretty masturbatory. The writing on a technical level is also pretty rough. Not to say that it's amateur, but it feels very first draft, like it came out in one intense writing session and that was it. And it's pretty one note. There's no complexity to this story at all. Ego stroking aside, it's a fun little story with a nice twist. It's definitely not his best, but you could do worse, and I wouldn't recommend it unless you're a completionist. And I'm giving A Bad Day at Fort Bragg a C. Hey everyone, I just read Altitude Rush, another Reilly short story, and for a premise that boils down to high stakes the floor is lava, it was pretty fun, but it was also pretty silly, par for the course I guess. It's a short story about a pair of master thieves on a heist to steal a world-changing document from a high-rise building in New York, contained within a display case that cannot go above or below a certain altitude. The pros? The concept is so bonkers, but somehow it works. It's so simple that it's perfect. It was a lot of fun. The world-changing secret contained in the document was pretty silly as well, but it worked for the short. I was actually engaged in learning the contents across the story, and it doesn't outstay its welcome. If this had been dragged out to a full novel or a movie, it would have been nails on chalkboard awful, but contained to 25 pages, it did everything there was to do and then ended. The cons? The writing on a technical level wasn't anything special. Reilly's done this kind of set piece much better in his later novels, and going back to this point in his career, it definitely doesn't compare. Speaking of which, a lot of this story feels like a trial run for 7 Ancient Wonders, and none of the ideas presented here are anywhere near as refined as they are in that book. And I don't know, the characters were pretty one note, it's a nitpick. It's honestly kind of hard to dislike this one. It was a fun 20-minute read. Maybe give it a go if you're a fan of Reilly's work and want to see how he's improved over time, but otherwise I don't think you'll miss anything if you give it a skip. And I'm giving Altitude Rush a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Rock Princess and the Thriller Writer, and not to be that guy, but his website claims this story stars Mitchell Reilly from A Bad Day at Fort Bragg, when the text is clearly about Mark Ridley. It's like you're not even a fan. And yes, this is sarcasm. It's a short story about the burgeoning romance between a thriller writer and a rock star, as they keep bumping into each other on their respective tours. The pros? Mark Ridley's taste in music. What a man of culture. It's definitely something different from Reilly's usual action thrillers, and even though I'm not completely sold on the execution, I admire the attempt to branch out. And it doesn't outstay its welcome. It doesn't get overly saccharine. I think it hits the sweet spot in between. The cons? The characters and dialogue don't feel very realistic, at least compared to Reilly's more recent leading men and women. It's also very cliched. Not that Reilly's other stories aren't heavily reliant on genre mainstays, but he has a much better command of the tropes of action than he does of romance. And it didn't really grab me. It's really not my kind of story, but that's just a nitpick. It's not my thing, and I think he's done it better elsewhere, but it's fine. I don't think it's essential reading for anyone other than a superfan, but I don't think you would regret reading it if you did, either. And I'm giving The Rock Princess and the Thriller Writer a B. Hey everyone, I just read Scarecrow by Matthew Reilly, and it was fun. Hang on, a globe-trotting adventure, a secret cabal with a nefarious conspiracy that only one man can stop, women getting stuffed in the fridge? Oh no, this is a Fleming Bond novel. It's a book about a bounty hunt ordered by a conspiracy of billionaires in order to kill every person in the world capable of stopping their grander scheme. And unfortunately for them, one of the men on that list is Shane Schofield. The pros? I love the free-for-all action of the bounty hunt with its various factions of mercenary groups and lone wolves. It was a fun ride, especially with some of them having ties to previous villains from Ice Station and Area 7. Aloysius Knight and Rufus were great additions to the core cast, but the real hero of this book was Mother. I would probably rate this book a lot lower if not for her. And as always, Reilly knows how to write a good action scene. The luxury car chase along the French Atlantic coast was a real standout. The cons? I really didn't like the direction Schofield and Gant's characters took in this book. The former spends most of the novel being passively shunted from set piece to set piece by Knight, and the latter is reduced to a damsel for the entire thing. Jonathan Killian, the main villain, was extremely one-note and pretty uninteresting compared to all the other antagonists present in the novel. Even his own accountant outshined him. And this book has the fastest pacing. Yep, that's what I wrote. That's what I meant. And this book has the fastest pacing of perhaps any media ever produced, and the first act really suffers for it. I felt like I was trying to get my feet beneath me while getting dragged along by a speeding train. My problems with it aside, it's still a fun read, and overall it's a satisfying conclusion for the characters that have appeared through Ice Station and Area 7. I'd recommend it if you're looking for an even faster, crazier Mission Impossible or James Bond film in book form, and I'm giving Scarecrow a B. Hey everyone, I just read Hovercar Racer by Matthew Reilly, and this is the best shonen manga I've ever read, except it's not a manga, it's a book. I love the idea that the Australian government sold the entire island of Tasmania to a racing school. I would absolutely buy them doing that. It's a book about a team of teenage racers attending an international school hoping to make it big in the super fast, super science fiction sport of hovercar racing. The pros? The races are great. Reilly really gets across the sheer speed and danger of the sport, and the amount of variety in the types of races on display, as well as which parts of them he chooses to focus on, really help to keep things from getting stale. Fabian was a wonderfully slimy villain. He's not a very deep character, but he's the perfect kind of haughty jerk anime bad guy that goes really well with this kind of story. And this book has an insane amount of plot threads and characters moving about, but somehow it manages to hold them all together and bring them down to a satisfying conclusion. The cons? The pacing of this book is bonkers. It was originally serialized online in the early 2000s, and the way the focus shifts from section to section is really reflective of that. It's a bit all over the place and possibly the fastest thing Reilly's ever written too. You know, I feel like I say that in every one of these reviews. The protagonists are all teenagers of varying ages, and none of them seem very believable to me. It felt very much like an adult's idea of what teenagers are like. It wasn't a deal breaker, but it did take me out of the book sometimes. And for how well all of the plot threads are tied up by the final page, the denouement did feel very abrupt. After how fast this book went, it almost felt like crashing right into a brick wall. This book is 20 volumes of a great shonen manga stuffed into 400 pages. It's fast, it's fun, I had a great time. I'd recommend it as a young adult book that doesn't act like swear words and violence don't exist, or as a light science fiction romp, and I'm giving Hovercar Racer an A. Hey everyone, I just read 7 Ancient Wonders by Matthew Reilly, and it was really good. Originally, they published this book as 7 Deadly Wonders in the United States because they thought the word ancient was too boring. Amazing. It's a book about a small team of international soldiers racing against the Catholic Church in the United States in a treasure hunt to rediscover the 7 wonders of the ancient world and reassemble the capstone of the Great Pyramid of Giza in order to prevent an environmental catastrophe and gain a supernatural reward. Goodness gracious, that was a long sentence. The prose? The action remains the strongest aspect of the book. The set piece in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was easily the highlight for me. I really liked the character stuff here, especially the flashbacks. Reilly's clearly improved on that front from previous books. And I really liked how this book wasn't afraid to slow down and let the reader breathe between action set pieces. The novel's pacing really benefits from it. The cons? Good as the character stuff is here, Marshall Judah and Francisco Del Puro are so boring as the main villains. There is very little that is interesting about either of them. The best I can say is that they are very functional. There is some very clunky exposition in this book. People are always commenting on some historical or archaeological fact, which is fine, but it always feels like the author speaking rather than the character, especially when the exposition is being delivered by someone caught in a death trap, waist deep in quicksand surrounded by snakes, with the ceiling rolling down to crush them dead. And the climax is a bit overstuffed to really shine. This is a good romp, kind of like a weird mesh of Lord of the Rings and Indiana Jones. So if that's your thing, or if you're a fan of adventure plots and treasure hunts, I'd recommend you give it a read, and I'm giving 7 Ancient Wonders an A. Hey everyone, I just read Hell Island by Matthew Reilly, and it was a return to form for Schofield. I like how this book was originally published exclusively in Australia, so to make a buck, Aussies started selling it to Reilly's US and UK fans over eBay. Very sneaky. It's a very short book about a bunch of different US special forces being dropped onto a mysteriously abandoned aircraft carrier off the coast of some island in the middle of nowhere, unaware that they are being stalked by an army of gun-wielding cyborg gorillas. I'm not joking. That's the plot. That's real. That's what happens. The prose? Schofield feels much more himself again than he was in his previous outing, Scarecrow, and Mother as always holds the team together. As usual, the action is on point. The first big fight with the gorillas was a standout. And the book's short length kept things from getting too fast or too furious, which was a nice change of pace. The cons? Look, I was on board with a stealth bomber that could turn invisible. I was fine with a virus that could target specific ethnicities. I was even okay with a conspiracy of billionaires setting off an international bounty hunt in 2003. But I draw the line at an army of cyborg gorillas. That is just too silly for this setting. The villains, not the gorillas but their handlers, were really weak. The short length of the book meant that most of them only got a page of focus before their deaths, and their plan in the first place is so monumentally stupid that I'm not even mad. And there's just not much plot here. The book feels like a bunch of scrapped ideas thrown into a blender. It's still a fun read, and it's only about 100 pages long, but it's more Matthew Reilly, so if you enjoy his other books, you'll probably find something to like here, and I'm giving Hell Island a B. Hey everyone, I just read Time Tours, another Matthew Reilly short. And are you a bad enough dude to save the president's niece? If the Great Zoo of China is Reilly's take on Jurassic Park, this is his Westworld. It's a short story about humble thriller writer Mitchell Reilly in attendance at the grand opening of a virtual reality theme park offering the guests the option of going back to the time of the dinosaurs, fighting in World War II, and spending time as the most famous person on the planet. And I'm sure absolutely nothing will go wrong. The prose? I'm a sucker for stories set in theme parks gone wrong, so this story was written for me. It's mine. You can't have it. The action was pretty simple, but it was still fun. And I like that Mitchell Reilly has his own little series of short stories, even if it is absurd. The cons? Much like A Bad Day at Fort Bragg, this story feels like a bit of an in-joke with the villain being a big-name literary critic who had his own manuscript rejected. You can almost smell the dirty laundry airing just off page. Most of this story is spent trying to save the president's niece, which just plays into boring old tropes, and it feels pretty lazy by today's standards. And it ends very abruptly. There is no denouement at all. This one wasn't terrible, but it's nothing special either. I don't regret reading it, but I'd only recommend it if you're an absolute mega fan, if you haven't given it a go already. And I'm giving Time Tours a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Six Sacred Stones by Matthew Reilly, and it was fantastic. Except for the Neither. They weren't fantastic, they were just kind of xenophobic. It's a book about an international treasure hunt to recover the titular stones in order to uncover the vertices of an ancient world-spanning machine, capable of averting a cosmic disaster as well as bestowing supernatural rewards. The prose? The action, as always, is great. The battle at Abu Simbel was the highlight for me. There are a lot of fun new characters in this book, but Wolf and Colonel Mao are a great improvement improvement over the first book's villains. Not only do they have a bit more depth, but it's also amusing to me to think the US and China are working together against the rest of the world in this plot. And I really love the descriptions and illustrations of the world-saving machine and its vertices. They may be entirely fictional compared to the Seven Ancient Wonders, but the scale and scope of them is great. The cons? Like I said before, the book comes across as a little xenophobic at times with the way it leans hard into old-fashioned colonialist stereotypes. The Japanese are depicted as racist fanatics who want to destroy the world out of spite for World War II. There's a secret village of primitive, deformed cannibals hidden in the jungles of the Congo. It just left a sour taste in my mouth. A character from the previous book gets very unceremoniously stuffed in the fridge early on in the book, and they're more or less completely forgotten about by the people who cared about them, which would be bad enough, but then later on a very similar character is introduced, only for they themselves to die anyway. I feel like the first could have taken the second's place and at least made their demise a bit more meaningful. And there are a lot of plot threads left hanging for a sequel by the final page. I found the book to be satisfying on its own, but if you're looking for a complete story, you won't find it here. This is a great read, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you've read the first and prepared to read the third. Otherwise, if you're a fan of globe-trotting adventures like Indiana Jones or Uncharted, you'll probably find something to enjoy here, and I'm giving The Six Sacred Stones an A. Hey everyone, I just read Complex 13, another Reilly short story, and it was very silly. You think I didn't notice how half the characters in this story were named after screenwriters, but I did! It's a story about a long-abandoned Soviet research base in the middle of nowhere, and the crack team of American Marines sent in to recover its secrets. The pros? The lead's call sign of the finisher gave me a good long chuckle. Boy have his achievements not aged well. The story has a good hook and a compelling setting, even if the secret abandoned research base feels very video gamey. And the twist ending was pretty well executed. The cons? This story is so shallow, there is nothing to it. The action wasn't anywhere close to as good as the set pieces in the novels, and the characters were just awful. All of them were red shirts. This is such a nothing story. It's like eating cardboard. It's not bad, it's not good, I wouldn't recommend it. All the ideas present in this story are used better in novels like Scarecrow vs. the Army of Thieves or The Great Zoo of China, and I'm giving Complex 13 a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Dead Prince, another Reilly short story, and meh. I liked this story better when he rewrote it as The Tournament. It's a short story about the murder of the French crown prince in a secluded monastery on the Atlantic coast, and the mystery of who did it. The pros? It's an experiment into different genres, historical and crime fiction specifically, and though I don't think it was completely successful, I'll give it points for the attempt. Most of the characters are pretty one-note, but I liked De Cristo, the lead. He was fun. And the mystery and its setting was really good. It deserved a better story. The cons? The solution and resolution to the mystery was very abrupt, not set up, and kind of problematic overall. Like with The Rock Princess and The Thriller Writer, Reilly has a much better grasp of the tropes of action thrillers than he does of historical or crime thrillers. And maybe it was decent at the time of release, but like I said, this whole story was completely remade into a much better work in The Tournament, and this original version just cannot compete anymore. If you enjoyed The Tournament and want to see where that book came from, maybe give this one a read, but otherwise I don't think you'll miss anything if you give it a skip. And I'm giving The Dead Prince a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Five Greatest Warriors by Matthew Reilly, and it was a really disappointing conclusion to the last two books. It's like these three books are the three acts of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The first two are great, and the third one is just an endless slog of nothing. Fight me. It's a book about an ongoing international treasure hunt to start an ancient world-spanning machine in order to save the planet from cosmic devastation and claim its supernatural rewards. The pros? I really like the father-son dynamic between Jack and Wolf here, how they're two sides of the same coin and are capable of working well together, even if they're usually working against each other. A lot of the action taken out of context is still really good. The battle in the Roman salt mine was a particularly gruesome highlight, and I do like the way it ends. The whole climactic section at Easter Island was great, even if I really don't like how it gets there. The cons? I absolutely hate new villains getting introduced and overwhelming the plot at the very end of a story, and this book gets hit with that hard. Yeah, Carnivore's cool in concept, but the story already had a perfectly fine main antagonist in Wolf, and don't even get me started on Kincaid. The conflict he added was so forced you could quite literally cut him out of the book and nothing would change. Japan once again gets the short end of the stick here. It's not even presented like the Japanese antagonists are a minority of bad people in a much larger benevolent majority like the villainous Americans are. The whole country is just written off as wanting the world destroyed. And this book has a lot of characters, which is fine, but so many of them just get pushed into the background or sidelined for large portions of the book that it feels like the author didn't know what to do with them. In fact, the aforementioned Carnivore almost feels like he was created just to capture or kill the characters the author didn't need for the last third of the book. I hate this book. It's a disappointing, bloated mess built around the skeleton of a good idea, and I do not recommend it at all. And I'm giving The Five Greatest Warriors an F. Sorry. Hey everyone, I just read Scarecrow and the Army of Thieves, or Scarecrow Returns as it's known elsewhere in the world, by Matthew Reilly, and this book ruled. I never knew I needed a Wall-E-esque robot with a machine gun in my life, but now that Bertie's here, I can't imagine living without him. It's a book about a terrorist army that takes over an old Soviet Union weapons testing facility in the Arctic Circle with the intent to destroy the superpowers of the Northern Hemisphere with a Cold War-era atmospheric superweapon, but unfortunately for them, the man the United States sends in to stop them is Shane Schofield. The pros? After several globe-trotting adventures, it was nice to return to a book set in a single place. Dragon Island was a great haunted house of Soviet-era superweapons that allowed for a lot of interesting set pieces. Speaking of, the action as usual was great. The team's first assault on the main island was great fun. And I really enjoyed the characters. Mother was fantastic as always, and Bertie, Renard and Bubba were all great additions to the cast, but I have to shout out the villain who, despite setting up the most over-the-top ridiculous terrorist army in the history of fiction, is still completely unprepared for the bonkers hero garbage Schofield pulls throughout the novel, and by the end just wants to be left alone. The cons? This book starts at 100 and never stops. The pacing is unbelievably quick, even compared to the earlier Schofield books, and especially compared to the comparatively slower Jack West trilogy that came right before it. This book also feels like it's trying to one-up previous entries in terms of nastiness. It just comes across as trying to be shocking for the sake of being shocking with how violent it gets at points, like the scene with the rats. And I really didn't enjoy the whole subplot with Zach, Emma and Bad Willie. Emma spends the whole time being menaced and threatened by Bad Willie, one of the villain's henchmen, and Zach, the civilian nerd dragged along for the ride, has to work up the courage to save her during the climax. It's just such a tired idea at this point, I didn't enjoy it. That aside, I had a lot of fun with this book. It feels like a great cheesy action movie, and unlike previous entries in the Schofield books, I feel like it embraces that aspect of itself rather than trying to push it away. If you're looking for a crazy action thriller that's on the shorter side, I'd easily give it a recommend, and I'm giving Scarecrow and the Army of Thieves an S. Hey everyone, I just read Roger Ascham and the King's Lost Girl, a prequel short to The Tournament, and it was okay. I'm still not entirely sure how to pronounce Ascham though. It's a short story about Roger Ascham, educated to the future Queen Elizabeth, and the grisly murders he is asked to investigate by King Henry VIII. The pros? King Henry, what a fun character. He's only in the story for a single scene, but he commands the page. He was a great time. The mystery is pretty decent. It's no instant noir classic, but it all fits together well, and I liked Roger Ascham as the lead. He's an interesting character and he lends himself well to these sorts of stories, even if his characterization here probably isn't at all like the man was when he was alive. The cons? The solution to the mystery was very obvious. There are only so many named characters who don't appear in the tournament here. It was very easy to see the twist ending coming. This story leans hard into exploitation tropes toward the end, and they just left me a bit sour. And in a lot of ways, this is just the Dead Prince again. It's certainly better, but it's still very noticeable reading them in quick succession. I liked this one. It was pretty good. I'd give it a read if you enjoyed the tournament. Just don't go in expecting the same amount of depth. And I'm giving Roger Ascham and the King's Lost Girl a B. Hey everyone, I just read The Tournament by Matthew Reilly, and say what you will about him, but he's not afraid to experiment. Going from a super fast action thriller like Scarecrow and the Army of Thieves to a mystery novel set during an international chess tournament in the 1540s was like running headfirst into a brick wall. It's a book about a long-forgotten chess tournament held in 1540s Istanbul by the Ottoman Empire and the grisly murders that come to overshadow the games, as told by a young Queen Elizabeth I. The pros? The twists and turns of the murder mystery were really good. The book does a great job of slowly peeling back the layers as it reveals the truth of the matter. The characters were really enjoyable. There are a lot of historical figures in attendance at the tournament, and the book goes out of its way to present them as people, no different from the entirely fictional characters who show up too. I especially liked the portrayal of a young Ivan the Terrible. And short though they are, the action scenes are great. The wolf attack in the Sultan's menagerie was a highlight. The cons? The book has sex scenes like Reilly's other books have action scenes, and some of them are pretty intense. It wasn't a problem for me, but it's something you should be aware of going in. An aspect of the murder plot involves a mentally ill man with a deformity who is portrayed as a psychopathic kill-crazy monster, and the depiction just soured the story a little for me. And for a book ostensibly about a chess tournament, there's surprisingly little chess here. The competition takes a backseat to the murder mystery and the exploration of sexual politics, which is fine, and I like the way the tournament aspect of the plot was resolved, but I would have liked to have seen a few more matches in greater detail than what we got. This is a very different kind of book compared to Reilly's other novels in terms of genre and content, but he pulled it off well. I quite enjoyed it. If you're a fan of historical fiction or murder mysteries, I'd recommend you give it a read. Just don't come for the chess. And I'm giving the tournament an A. Hey everyone, I just read Troll Mountain by Matthew Reilly, and I was whelmed. It wasn't great, it wasn't terrible, it simply was. It's a book about a young man who goes on a quest to steal a magical elixir from a mountain kingdom of trolls in order to cure his village's ongoing plague. The pros? I liked the combination of fantastical scenarios with mundane explanations on display here, like how the plague affecting the village is obviously scurvy, and the magical elixir is just lemon juice. I enjoyed the small scale of the conflict. In a market of truly epic fantasy stories, it was a nice change of pace. It gives the book a bit of a Hobbit-esque feel. And the action was great. Do you even have to ask? The climax where the mountain comes crashing down was definitely the highlight. The cons? The characters are pretty bare bones, which is fine, but I'll always prefer nuance to simple archetypes. The book has some interesting takes on its fantasy elements, but it's too short to really flesh them out to their fullest potential. And the only two female characters, the lead's sick sister and the good troll's love interest, are basically just blank slates for the male heroes to save in one way or another, and I'm just tired of that kind of storytelling. It's not a bad book, but I'm definitely not the target audience. I'd still recommend it if you're looking for a low-stakes Tolkien-esque fantasy story or something for a younger reader, but for me it was just alright, and I'm giving Troll Mountain a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Great Zoo of China by Matthew Reilly, and I really wanted to love this book. It would make a fantastic video game though. It's a book about a press tour held to introduce the world to China's newest attraction, a zoo populated with real-life dragons, and absolutely nothing bad happens, and no one gets eaten, and I'm obviously lying through my teeth. The pros? I love the layout of the park, how some areas are very theme parky and other areas are administrative and others still are military institutions. Each of them feels distinct in the narrative and I honestly would have liked to have seen more of it. CJ Cameron is a compelling protagonist. She's much more her own character than a lot of Reilly's previous female leads, excluding Mother of course, and she stays on top of the chaos throughout the book. And the action is great, as usual. The initial dragon attack on the cable car was a highlight, and so was the flashback regarding CJ's battle with an alligator. The cons? That said, the garbage truck chase that follows the initial attack is probably the only action set piece of Reilly's that I've outright disliked. It just keeps going and going, no matter how many dragons they throw off the truck, there's always another one ready to land and continue the fight. Speaking of the dragons, I really don't like that they can talk. I'm fine with dragons talking in principle, that's what makes Smaug such a great character, but in a story like this that tries to present dragons in a realistic way, the fact that they can communicate with humans just shatters the suspension of disbelief for me. And after solid first and second acts, this book just runs out of steam in the last third. After the last big set piece, it feels like all the remaining villains just show up together to die unceremoniously one by one, so that the surviving heroes can get on with it and escape. It's easy to sum up this book as Jurassic Park with dinosaurs, but the two works. Jurassic Park with dinosaurs, that is just Jurassic Park. It's easy to sum up this book as Jurassic Park with dragons, but the two works are actually quite different, and it's a lot of fun besides. I'd recommend it if you did enjoy Jurassic Park, or if you're a fan of creature features, dragons, and action thrillers. And I'm giving The Great Zoo of China an A. It would have been an S if the dragons hadn't talked, sorry. Hey everyone, I just read The Four Legendary Kingdoms by Matthew Reilly, and it was really fun. This book has a little bit of everything from each of his previous novels. It's a greatest hits in the best way. It's a book about Jack West Jr., the hero of Seven Ancient Wonders and its sequels, kidnapped out of retirement along with his family in order to compete in a tournament for the amusement of four secretive kingdoms, with the fate of the world at stake. But unfortunately for Jack, one of the other competitors is Shane Schofield. The pros? West and Schofield finally getting the chance to interact was great. It could have just been fan service garbage, but the book takes time and effort to introduce Schofield into the story in a meaningful way, and best of all, Mother's here too. I really love the way this book weaved the Four Kingdoms into not only the previous Jack West entries, but also the Schofield novels as well. Aside from one minor error, the attention to continuity and callbacks were really rewarding for a long-time reader. And the action, as usual, was great. The fifth challenge, a car chase through a giant underground city, was a real standout here. The cons? Despite the book's title, only two of the Four Kingdoms, land and the underworld, get any real focus in the story. Sea and Sky barely get any attention at all, which felt like a missed opportunity. As is common with many of Reilly's big tournament stories, a lot of the competitors are just there to be cannon fodder despite their potential as interesting characters or adversaries. And the side plot featuring Stretch and Pooh Bear, two of Jack's allies from the previous trilogy, just feels like an excuse to dump exposition that can't fit into the single-setting environment of the tournament where the rest of the book takes place. This book is really a stepping stone between the first Jack West trilogy and the second Jack West trilogy, but it's still a great read in my opinion. It might push the suspension of disbelief for some, but I really enjoyed it, and I'd recommend it to fans of adventure adventure stories, action stories, and Reilly's other work, even if it does require the context of two separate series to fully appreciate. And I'm giving The Four Legendary Kingdoms an S. Hey everyone, I just read Jack West Jr. and the Hero's Helmet, a prequel story to the Jack West Jr. books, and it wasn't bad, but it wasn't really necessary either. It's a short story about the circumstances of how Jack came to own his iconic fireman's helmet. The pros? It's great to see Wizard again, even if only for a page or two. I liked that this story is set so early in the timeline that Lily hasn't even been born yet. It's interesting to see Jack as Action Man instead of Action Dad. Yeah, it's not much, but it was nice to get a glimpse at his character back then. And I enjoyed how this story added a little more subject matter from the 4 through 1 books into the early days of the series. It makes the whole thing feel a little more cohesive overall, instead of it being two obviously separate series getting smashed together. The cons? The action was pretty perfunctory here. Reilly's done this sort of set piece before, and he's done it better. It felt pretty basic. There's not really any clever way Jack comes into possession of the helmet. It's not like Indiana Jones where it's a bitter keepsake, and I just don't think something so simple deserved its own story. And overall it felt a little bit rough, like a first draft. It's not bad by any means, but it didn't really do anything for me. If you're a super fan of the Jack West books, give it a read. It's pretty short. Otherwise I think you can skip it. And I'm giving Jack West Jr. and the Hero's Helmet a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Free Secret Cities by Matthew Reilly, and I really wanted to like this book. It does tickle me though to think that these books and the tournament now exist in the same universe, thanks to a reference to that book's chess competition hidden here. It's a book about a hunt to find free secret cities and empower free immortal weapons in order to pass the first trial necessary to avert the end of the universe and, as a reward, take over the world. The pros? The first act is really good. The book had me hooked right up until the London set piece. There's a couple of great returning characters from Reilly's early books, but the Free Secret Cities really belongs to its villains. Sphinx, Orlando, Mendoza, and the Knights of the Round Table are easily the most interesting aspects of the novel. And the action is still very strong. The assault on the Knight's stronghold was a standout. The cons? A lot of this book feels like a rehash of 6 Sacred Stones, right down to Jack getting entombed in a secret mine and the heroes needing to help the villains during the climax due to an outside factor. This book also goes out of its way to kill off a bunch of characters from earlier Jack West novels in really mean-spirited ways. A few of them aren't even given the chance to say anything before they get offed. And after the political upheaval in the secret royal world caused in the last book, there was a great amount of potential to give the kingdoms of Sea and Sky more focus, but neither of them have much of a role. The story still belongs to the kingdoms of land and the underworld. I'm torn on this book. It had a great opening act, but the pacing fumbled hard after the London set piece, and it never really recovered in my opinion. Given the amount of context needed from previous books anyway, I wouldn't recommend it if you're not already a fan, and I'm giving The Free Secret Cities a C. Hey everyone, I just read The Secret Runners of New York by Matthew Reilly, and I was pleasantly surprised. This book is so unlike any of Reilly's other novels that if you told me it was ghostwritten by a woman, I'd almost believe it. It's a book about a teenage girl who joins a high school for the ultra-wealthy in New York, where she meets a group of fellow students capable of travelling through time to a near future where civilization has collapsed. The pros? The teenage characters all felt believable, from the narrator Sky to a group of friends and enemies. It's easily Reilly's best character work, if only because it's so far removed from his usual cast of characters that it shows his range. I really enjoyed how the plot didn't devolve into a use knowledge from the future to save the present kind of story. The focus stays on the group dynamic, and because of the way time travel works here, the world ends no matter what. Honestly deserved. And I liked how the book used different fonts to distinguish between chapters set in 2018 and chapters set in 2040. It was a nice touch. The cons? Everyone in this book is an awful flaming dumpster of a human being, aside from Sky and a handful of others. True, that is the point, but it made the first 2 acts of the book a very hard read for me. This book leaves a couple of plot threads hanging for a potential sequel, but the way they're resolved in this book just feels a little awkward. And for a book about time travel, it takes a long time for that aspect of the story to become important. It feels like half the book goes by before the group even ventures out of the magic time tunnel to investigate what's happened to the outside world. If nothing else, this book shows Matthew Reilly's range. It's definitely not my cup of tea, but I enjoyed it for what it was, and I'd recommend it to fans of young adult science fiction, or fans of things like Stephen King and Life is Strange, or indeed Gossip Girl. And I'm giving The Secret Runners of New York a B. Hey everyone, I just read Roger Ascham and the Dead Queen's Command, another Reilly short story, and it was actually pretty good. I really enjoyed it. It's a short story about Roger Ascham, the former school teacher of the recently crowned Queen Elizabeth I, who is tasked with discovering the identity of a serial killer who has a habit of sending dolls of his victims to court in the days before he murders them. The pros? It's great to see these characters at a later stage of their lives. Roger as a middle-aged man, Elizabeth not only as a young woman but as the Queen. I really enjoyed that aspect aspect of the story. I also really enjoyed the mystery behind the serial killer. It's pretty simple by necessity of it being a short story, but it's a satisfying Renaissance noir. And I love the way Bloody Mary just hangs over this story. The history that the plot is built around haunts its characters in a really interesting way. It was very atmospheric. The cons? I kind of want more, honestly. I think this story could have been fleshed out into a novella at the very least. Like with the previous Ascham short story, there aren't really any big twists or turns here. If you're a fan of the genre, you can probably see where it's going pretty early on, especially given the title, and it ends very abruptly for how well it builds up to a climax. I would have liked to have got a bit more of a denouement. This was a good read. I was pleasantly surprised. Reilly might be onto more than I thought with this whole Queen Elizabeth I solves crimes idea. I hope he does more. And I'm giving Roger Ascham and the Dead Queen's Command an A. Hey everyone, I just read Jack West Jr. and the Chinese Splashdown, and it was pretty unnecessary, to be completely honest. I'm not really sure why this needed to be written. It's a short story about Jack West Jr.'s best friend Wally, who he talks about all the time in the main books, and that one time he was accidentally right about a conspiracy theory. The pros? I don't have much good to say about this story, but it did actually give us a glimpse into the politics of the kingdoms of sea and sky, and you know what? I'll take it. I didn't like Wally much as a character, but the idea of a guy who hunts zombie satellites is really cool. You could write a much better story around that concept. And I'll give the story this: it was well put together, well written, and it did a pretty decent job of sticking to blank spots in the Jack West Jr. series without stepping on the toes of established canon. The cons? This story is like that direct-to-video Lion King sequel about how Timon and Pumbaa were secretly involved in every scene of the original movie, and I hate it. Speaking of which, Wally just wasn't a very interesting character beyond his hobby of zombie satellite hunting. Certainly not interesting enough to have a whole story written about him. And it just adds nothing to the series. It's completely unnecessary. Yeah, I didn't enjoy this one. I think you can pretty safely give it a skip, and I'm giving Jack West Jr. and the Chinese Splashdown a D. Sorry. Hey everyone, I just read The Two Lost Mountains by Matthew Reilly, and I don't even know what to say anymore. These books have jumped the rails and charged right off the side of a cliff, but I guess I'm here for it. It's a book about a hunt to find two lost mountains and complete the second trial necessary to avert the end of the universe, and, as a reward, take over the world. The pros? It takes the entire book to get there, but the final action scene where each of the factions is scrambling to get inside the doors to the final trial before they shut is a lot of fun. I really liked the idea of the mountain trial, needing to ride this massive temple down the middle of a mountain while the moon is directly overhead. And there was some nice character stuff here, like how we finally learned Sky Monster's real name. The cons? I still hate new villains getting introduced right at the end of the story, and Garthen Rasta is no exception to that. He doesn't even have the decency to be interesting like Carnivore was. He's just annoying. The siren bells, these big bells that instantly put everyone who hears them to sleep, are ridiculous. I couldn't stand them. And this book is just so inconsequential to the overall narrative. None of the main villains are defeated, none of the important heroes die. We all know everyone's going to make it to the final trial. There was just nothing to be invested in here. This book honestly feels like a parody of its predecessors. I didn't hate it, but I didn't enjoy it, and I certainly wouldn't recommend it. And I'm giving The Two Lost Mountains a D. Sorry. Hey everyone, I just read The One Impossible Labyrinth by Matthew Reilly, and it was fine. I went into this book expecting to hate it, so the fact that it turned out as well as it did is pretty good. It's a book about several factions racing to complete the final trial, the titular labyrinth, in order to avert the end of the universe and claim ultimate power as their reward. The pros? This book provides a conclusive ending to the story started in Seven Ancient Wonders. Pretty much everything is resolved by the final page. I really liked the flashbacks, getting to see Wolf again and learning how Jack and Sky Monster met. It was fun. And the action, as usual, was excellent. The massive battle in the middle of the Red Sea halfway through the book was a standout. The cons? This book has so much to resolve from previous entries that a few characters are just dealt with as afterthoughts. I feel like a couple of the main villains could have been taken out in Two Lost Mountains to free up some space here. This book felt so bloodless too. The amount of times characters seemingly die only to come back later is absurd. There was no suspense at all. And I really didn't like the epilogue. Had the conflict been resolved with some significant cost to the heroes, I think it would have worked better, but as it is, it just felt overly saccharine. Still, epilogue aside, this was a fun conclusion to the series, and I'm glad it ended on a high note. I wouldn't recommend this book on its own, but if you're a fan of Indiana Jones style adventure stories, maybe consider giving the Jack West novels a read. And I'm giving The One Impossible Labyrinth a B. Hey everyone, I just watched Interceptor, and I know, it's not a book, but it's a Matthew Reilly story, so it's going in the video. The way people just kept dumping bodies through a hole in the floor throughout this movie was just chef's kiss. It's a film about a United States missile defense base in the middle of the Atlantic that comes under attack by a group of nefarious individuals and the one woman who is capable of stopping their evil plan. The pros? The lead protagonist and the lead antagonist were both really good. They gave a couple of great performances and played well off each other. I thought the action, ironically, was a bit stale at the beginning, but once the film got going and felt a bit more comfortable in its own skin, the action really picked up. It can't match the set pieces of the books, but it does match the intensity, and it's great to finally see that depicted in film. Especially its gory coup de grace during the climax. And I love the setting of the defense base, how it gets damaged and run down over the course of the film. It's pretty simple, but it added a lot of character. The cons? The movie made the most of whatever budget it had, but one of the downsides of that is that 80% of this film is spent in a single room. In fact, you can feel the much grander epic action flick this project began as aching to escape the confines of its budget, and it really chafes. Not only does the film recycle a lot of ideas and plot points from Reilly's earlier works, it's also fairly predictable. At no point was I surprised by anything that happened. It was all very paint by numbers. And this movie makes the bold decision to include a subplot about harassment in the military, which is a very serious issue that feels very out of place in an otherwise cheesy action film. I'll give it points for the attempt, but I don't think it worked. It just felt too tonally discordant the way it was depicted. This movie is bursting at the seams with potential. It wants to be so much more than it is, but that's the problem with film. Budget will always win over ambition 9 times out of 10. That said, it's not a bad film. I had fun with it. Give it a watch if you've got a couple of hours to spare, and I'm giving Interceptor a B. Hey everyone, I just read not that either. There it is. I just read Cobalt Blue by Matthew Reilly, and it was good. Yeah, you can really tell it started off as a screenplay though, like wow. It's a novella about a Cold War between the United States and Russia that suddenly grows very hot when America's only superhero dies, and their Russian equivalent swings over to settle some scores and level some cities. The pros? In a market that is completely oversaturated with superhero media, I do think this story actually managed to do something interesting with the concept, by limiting the number of truly superpowered characters to 2 and framing the central conflict as a new stage of the Cold War between the US and Russia. In that way, it did a good job of justifying the kind of country-themed superheroes that made more sense in the mid-20th century than they do today, and overall I really enjoyed this more reined-in setting. Aside from the world-building, I really enjoyed the characters. Cobalt and the Fury of Russia are rare examples of middle-aged and elderly superheroes, and they are a great contrast not only to each other, but their children. And Cassie, the protagonist, was another compelling leading lady in a lot of ways too, with her decision to stay out of the limelight and keep her powers hidden, unlike her half-siblings. I wish there had been more of this book to give the cast more depth, because there was a ton of untapped potential here. And I liked that the book treated its superheroes with some amount of realism. They are flying around throwing buildings at each other, yes, but they're still beholden to universal laws, their bodies still age, and their costumes are designed to keep them breathing while flying faster than the speed of sound, instead of aesthetic or sex appeal. It was refreshing. The cons? This book is way too short. It has a lot of characters and a lot of plot across 3 decades to get through in 200 pages, and it just isn't enough. Heaps of people die, but we never get much of a chance to know them, so their deaths mean nothing. The story is constantly jumping around in time, and it can be easy to get lost, even with the use of different coloured text to distinguish between the past and the present. Plot threads are introduced and then dropped, or don't get the attention they need to properly land. It's too much for such a small book, and it's definitely a result of the novella starting out as a screenplay. This book also feels 20 years too late, not just due to the oversaturation of superhero media in general these days, but because quite a few of its plot points and finer details struck me as kind of problematic. For example, Cobalt comes from a wealthy American family and chooses to be a good superhero, while the Fury of Russia is just a violent peasant who chooses to be an evil one. And it's not treated with any nuance. One of Cobalt's children is an honourable cop, another is a no-nonsense army guy, both of which are harder to sell at face value in this day and age. A real-world billionaire's wealth is instrumental, if coincidental, in saving the day, which is just kind of disgusting. But the biggest issue in my mind is the villain's outright stated plan of hunting Cassie down and keeping her her as his personal slave, specifically because she is Cobalt's natural child and not the result of IVF like all her siblings, which is just gross and weird. It would have been enough that he wanted to hunt her down out of curiosity because she stays out of the spotlight, but whatever. Yeah, there were a lot of problems here. And in terms of action, there's just nothing here you haven't seen before in other superhero media. Be it subversive like The Boys or cliched like the MCU, the book does it well, but it's the weakest link between the world building and the characters in my opinion. There is a lot to say about this one. I enjoyed it, but mostly feel frustrated by how much better it could have been if it had been given a little more room to breathe, and a few of its more questionable aspects had been given a second look. If you're looking for a lighter take on The Boys, where not every superhero is a complete scumbag, you'll probably find something to like here, but if you're not a fan of Reilly's work already, this isn't going to change your mind, and I'm giving Cobalt Blue a B. It hovered so close to an A, but it's a B. Sorry. And since we're here, one more for the road. Hey everyone, I just read and watched Matthew Reilly's entire body of work, as far as I could find anyway, and it was fun. Eclectic, certainly, but fun. He's an author mostly known for his fast-paced action thrillers, but he's not afraid to throw in the odd historical drama or young adult novel either. The prose? Are you kidding me? The action set pieces, their plotting, their pacing, their spectacle, their gore. No matter what book of his you're reading, there's probably an action scene to grab your attention. Mother is such a great character. She carries a lot of the book she's present in, and I'm always happy to see her. And reading all of his books together, it's really clear to see how much he improves on a technical level, how much he improves in terms of plotting and pacing, how much he improves writing women, how much more confident he is when experimenting with genres outside of action thriller. It's really great to see. The cons? This becomes very obvious when you read all of his work together, but he recycles a lot of plot points and premises multiple times, both within the same and across different series. And it's not a huge problem, I guess, but it's definitely a con for me. He's got much better about this as time has gone on, but a few of his stories utilise a lot of stereotypes and caricatures of women and people of colour in different cultures in terms of depiction or their roles in the plot, and it kind of sours some of his earlier works for me now. And I don't think he ends long-running series very well. The endings of each individual book are pretty okay, but if it's the final volume of a long-running series where he has to wrap everything up, generally I don't think he does a very good job. But that's just me. I don't think his work is for everyone. I'd probably be a lot less forgiving of his earlier work if I hadn't grown up with it, but if you're looking for a big action blockbuster in book form, his work from Contest to Army of Thieves fits that bill really well, and his work after that point offers something a little more experimental and a little more character focused. So if any of these books strike your fancy, maybe give them a read, and I'm giving the works of Matthew Reilly an A. It probably should be a B, but for me and my nostalgia it just scrapes past the line. It's still an A. That's my final decision. And that's it. Every Matthew Reilly story reviewed, and here they are all ranked. I always enjoy going through these books every few years and catching up on the releases I've missed. They'll always be special to me, but I know they're definitely not for everyone. Anyway, thank you so much for the year of support. It's been a lot of fun doing these reviews and reading books I probably never would have if people hadn't suggested them. Speaking of which, I'm always looking for reading suggestions, so if you've got something you'd like me to review, post it in the comments down below and I'll add it to the list. I promise I'll get to it eventually. If you enjoy overly long video game critiques, why not check out my second channel? The link is in the description below. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video and want to see more, please like, subscribe, and share the video around. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye everyone.